this to the stream, and you can speak, but I'm just going to keep everybody in the background there. Okay, with all of that out of the way, let's get started. So we got to read Edwards and Papp's introduction, and this is the last class that's going to be about any sort of introduction, and then we're going to get right into the really fun debate and Paul Ray and all of that stuff. But this is Edwards and Papp's introduction to the topic of determinism, freedom, and moral responsibility. So let's just go over sort of what they talked about, as they generally gave us a feeling of the field and the different types of camps in it. So there's various camps. There's determinists. Sometimes there's a camp called the hard determinists. And there's sort of different ways that you can be a hard determinist or you can be a determinist, but essentially they deny free will. There's libertarians who affirm free will. There's compatibilists, and there's different ways of being compatibilists, but they're the sorts of people who try to say in one way or another, the world could be deterministic and at the same time you could have free will. There's the pragmatists, which they touched upon real quickly, and I added in the divinists because they mentioned Catholic theologians as another kind of libertarians, and so we'll keep them in there as a camp. But essentially we've got libertarians, we've got compatibilists, we've got determinists, sort of on a spectrum here. Okay, we're going to get to do a tiny bit of elementary logic. There's these classes are intro to philosophy. There's people here that have jobs programming computers. There's people here who are farmers. There's these classes designed for anybody, so some of it might seem a little basic, but worth going over again to some of you. I like paying attention to all of it. In any case, we're only going to do enough of this sort of thing to cover what we need to cover. But let me move this closer to the camera so it doesn't look like I'm looking away. Okay, so conditionals are logical statements, if then, if X, then Y. What it means is, I don't know if X is true, but if it is true, so is Y. If John studies, he will get an A. That's an example of a conditional. A syllogism is a three-proposition deductive argument. The first two lines are premises, and the third is the conclusion. A valid syllogism is one so structured that if the two premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. For instance, this is a conditional syllogism. If A, then B. A, meaning I think A is true. It's an affirmation of A. Therefore, B. Okay. So there's four types of things that you can do. Four basic things you can do with a syllogism of conditional first premise. If A, then B, A, therefore B. If A, then B, B, therefore A. If A, then B, not A, therefore not B. And if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. And some of you have already identified the fact that two of these are invalid. They don't actually logically make sense. You might find an argument in that form, if A, then B, B, therefore A must be true. But that's, of course, not the case, right? If John pushes Frank off the cliff, Frank will fall and die. Frank fell and died. Therefore, John pushed him off the cliff. No, Mary might have pushed him off the cliff, right? That's not logical. A doesn't follow from 1 and 2. If A, then B and B. And likewise, if A, then B, not A, therefore not B. This is important. If determinism is true, then we don't have free will. But determinism is not true. Therefore, we do have free will. Not have free will. Well, that doesn't follow either, right? Determinism could be false and we could still not have free will. However, there's two other arguments here that can be made that are logical. If A, then B, if determinism is true, then we do not have free will. Determinism is true. Therefore, we don't have free will. That's affirming the antecedent. And we have negating the consequent. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. So if determinism is true, then we have no free will. But we don't have no free will. We do have free will. Therefore, determinism is not true. Those two are logically sound, of course. And so, I shouldn't have done it with all those words, but if Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That obviously works, affirming the antecedent. However, affirming the consequent does not work. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is a man. No, Socrates could be the name of my dog. Just because it's mortal doesn't mean that it's a man, because of 1 and 2. Okay, negating the antecedent is also illogical. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is not a man. Therefore, Socrates is not mortal. Obviously, that doesn't work for the same reason. And then we have negating the consequent, which does work. If Socrates is a man, then Socrates is mortal. Socrates is not mortal. Therefore, Socrates is not a man. That would follow logically, right? Okay, fine. So let's see what they talked about in this introduction. They said there's some ambiguity here. So the bigot hates persons of category X without cause. When we say this, we do not mean there's no way of understanding what made the irrational bigot have his positions. We are not denying causes like he was raised by bigots, or he is not good at statistical thinking and had a few bad run-ins with persons of category X that made him let me make this bigger so I can read it. And made unjustifiable generalization conclusions about all such persons. Or his life has turned out badly and he finds critical self-reflection too difficult, so he's looking for a scapegoat, right? A person who says he hates people of category X without cause could also agree with any or all of those 3 statements. They don't mean it's without cause in a deterministic sense. They just mean it doesn't have a good cause. All of these would be acceptable to the person who says that he has his views without cause. And the person who says that wouldn't find the acceptance of any of those thoughts difficult. Instead, he simply means he doesn't have, good reasons for his bigotry. All right, so sometimes we say something is without cause, we just mean it's without a good cause. But people who want to deny determinism, they sort of, at least according to the determinists, have to deny that there's any cause, that something is caused. If it's caused, it's determined. And if it's determined, it's not free. And so they're going to try to hold them to that standard. Okay, let's see. So let's look at some of the camps really quickly. Let's look at some of the ideas they bring up. First of all, determinism. It might not be possible not to accept determinism, they suggest. We assume it in many of our everyday activities, they pointed out. We would be flabbergasted in certain contexts if a person assumed that some important phenomena was in principle inexplicable. The assumption of determinism might be worded thusly. If all the conditions of one state of the universe were known at any time in the universe, then every future event could be predicted. Or simply, all events are sufficiently caused. All right, so there is no event that isn't sufficiently caused, and only the sufficiently caused events are the ones that happen. This applies, almost all people agree, to physical phenomena. Not everybody, by the way. The determinist would simply say, the laws of physics do not cease to exist at your skull. Now we have to talk about moral responsibility, because some people who are determinists deny moral responsibility, and we've already seen some excerpts of a few of them in the introduction we had, and we're going to be reading more like that. But some determinists say it's only because of determinism that ideas of moral responsibility that we really care about make any sense. So let's just talk about moral responsibility independent of determinism and free will for a moment and say, even though we tend to assume an unbroken overarching causal nexus under which all phenomena are comprehensible, we also, just like we instinctively seem to think that, at least in many cases, we also have a working assumption that most often a person's choices to do something we regard as good or bad make that person responsible for those actions. The whole debate we are having in this first section is mostly concerned with exploring how to reconcile these two seemingly contradictory instincts. Some determinists argue that if not for the fact, I've already said this, but if not for the fact that there's an unbroken chain of causal events governing even human actions and choices, punishment, for instance, would make no sense, that you need determinism to have the desired notions of moral responsibility. But there's others who say, look, that just can't be the case, including some determinists who say, look, the Big Bang caused my actions today. The Big Bang determined completely whether I would eat Count Chocula or Cheerios this morning, and it has nothing to do with me, so you can't hold me accountable for it. Okay, so that makes us have to look really briefly at the ideas of punishment, and we're just briefly going over these things so that we can discuss them when we go to the discussion time and when we start reading these different essays. But there are famously three major explanations or defenses or apologies for arguments for punishment: corporal punishment, political, legal, legislative punishment, that type of thing, state-induced punishment, or social consequences. Obviously, it's retribution, deterrence, or rehabilitation, right? Retribution ideas of punishment are, look, you did something bad and the scales need to be balanced, and so now something bad has to happen to you. Deterrence is, look, if we create enough negative causes for your actions to make you less inclined to do them again and to scare off others who are so inclined to do the same types of actions, then all the better. So let's create some deterrence to stop you or make it less likely for people to do that sort of thing. And rehabilitation, we punish you to teach you a lesson so that you can become a better sort of person. Available to the determinists. Now, maybe we can debate this, but it seems to me that deterrence is the only argument really available to maybe a type of rehabilitation in the same sort of a sense, where you're deterring them from acting by turning them into the sort of person who wouldn't do that. And maybe that's as much as rehabilitation could mean to a determinist. But essentially, rehabilitation would fall into the same idea of deterrence, I think, for a determinist. Libertarians could choose from all three. They could only like retribution, they could only like deterrence, they could only like rehabilitation, they could like any combination of them, or they could think punishment is always a bad idea. So fate and fatalism. One can be a fatalist and not be a determinist. A determinist is a fatalist. So let's talk about the difference between fatalism and determinism. It's kind of similar to a theological idea of God foreknowing everything that's going to happen versus making it happen. It's not clear that there's a difference between these two ideas, but there's some pretty powerful philosophical examinations that try to cut between them that can be kind of impressive. In short, determinists don't like being called fatalists. Oh, some of them do, actually. So a distinction between predeterminism and determinism exists with something like the Humean compatibilist positions. This distinction is unavailable or considered insignificant to the hard determinists. So the hard determinists are basically saying, look, there's no difference between knowing what's going to happen and all of the things that are going to happen being fated, right? You can't both know what's going to happen in the future for sure and say that the future isn't just fatalistic. So that's one of the reasons why some hard determinists just say that they're fatalists. And it's also one of the arguments that some libertarians will say against them. But the response from the determinists is, so what? That's what I think is true. I think that's the world we're living in. I couldn't help but throw in this old limerick. There once was a man who said, damn, it is borne in upon me I am an engine that moves in predestinate grooves. I'm not even a bus. I'm a tram. Okay, really quickly. In logic, sometimes we write propositions with singular letters. So if we say FW, maybe we mean free will exists or there is free will. If then is usually written as an arrow. So you might say FW arrow D, right? If there is free will, then we live in a deterministic world, which obviously doesn't make sense, but that's the way you would read that FW arrow D. If there is free will, then determinism is true. Something like that is how it would be read. The not symbol is this squiggly negative sign. An example would be free will is false, being written as squiggly line FW. And is usually a caret that points upward, or incidentally is a caret that points downward. But and is a caret that points upward. It's kind of including two things in the tent. Free will exists and determinism is true. That would be written as FW and not D. Or free will exists and determinism is false would be written as FW and not D. And then therefore is usually written as 3, or it's often written as 3 dots like that. Let me just turn the sound off on my phone so we don't have to hear that anymore. All right, we're almost done with this. Why do we talk about that? So that we can write in shorthand the arguments. So here's our battlefield. We've got determinism on one side and free will on the other, and we're going to start reading essays and arguments about where the truth lies in all of this. First, we have the army of the determinists. Their argument is determinism is true, or if determinism is true, then there is no free will. Determinism is true, therefore there is no free will. On the other end of the field, we have the libertarians. They're saying, I agree with you. If determinism is true, then we do not have free will. However, we do have free will. Not that we do not have free will, right? The double negative there. We do have free will. Therefore, not determinism. Determinism must be false if that. Okay. Wait, hold on a second. What am I doing here? Making a mess. Okay. Let's try it that way. Okay. Then we have the pseudo-problemists, which are a type of compatibilist, but I'm going to keep them separate because I want to identify a difference. I should have kept them the same on the map. The pseudo-problemists are sort of sitting at the side of the field saying, stop fighting, you're both right, you just don't understand it yet. But I'm going to keep them separate from the other camp of the rest of the compatibilists because there's actually a different ways of being compatibilists, just as there are different ways of being determinists or libertarians. So in any case, basic pseudo-problemists are saying, I deny the first premise. It is not the case that if determinism is true, then there is no free will. Okay? And then they go about affirming determinism and affirming free will. And so their conclusion is we have both. We have determinism and we have free will. All right. As for the general compatibilists, they have the exact same conclusion. So you can see logically they're in the exact same camp. They believe in determinism and free will, although I would say that the main reason I put them up there is that there's a positive constructivist type of compatibilist who say, look, yeah, there's a bit of ambiguity here, but also I have to do more than just say it's a play on words that's making you believe there's no such thing. I'm going to come up with an argument for how in a deterministic world freedom can develop. And so they're in the same camp. They're a way of being a pseudo-problemist is a way of being a compatibilist, and most compatibilists are also pseudo-problemists. But I just wanted to distinguish them. Beyond that, we have Jamesian pragmatists. They just say free will. Actually, they don't just say anything. They do an impressive job of arguing that the logic of the determinists, it cannot be deductive and cannot be taken that serious. They're taking it too seriously. And then they say the logic of the libertarians is exactly the same. They're both pretending to know more than we can know. And then they say, instead of saying, well, we don't know anything, so whatever, they say, no, wait a minute. Just because we can't get a solid deductive knowing for sure something here, we do have some tools that are available to us for trying to sort this out. And actually, I should have left this on both sides because the pragmatists say you can use those tools to end up in determinism or to end up in libertarianism, even though William James ends up in libertarianism, and he gives us good arguments for it. In any case, there's the divine originists. They're saying, look, there's free will because God made it. Now, I sort of did my best, and maybe we'll have to move these around, of mapping out the various people we're going to be reading in this class and sort of placing them kind of where they fall on this map. We're going to start with Paul Ray and HRB. And I think for some reason they put William James next. I think that should probably be last or close to last. I'm not sure. But in any case, these are the guys that we're going to be reading as they argue in these fields. And then I added a bunch of other guys that you might want to read. So famously, Scott Adams is an absolutely fantastic defender of a kind of hard determinism. Sam Harris famously wrote some books like, Free Will, where he denies that it exists in a similar manner. I was speaking to one of the students who can't be here today, although we're going to read his notes to us and his questions, because he has some interesting things for our discussion time about the fact that he might be really interested in Daniel Dennett's book, Freedom Evolves, since he seems to think that there's some merit in both sides of these things. And Dennett is one of those constructivist, compatibilist types. And then there's the Sir Arthur Eddington is interesting. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to try to defend all these views whenever we examine them. We're not reading Sir Arthur Eddington, but well, I haven't read him yet, so I'm not going to criticize him. There's a reason for thinking that there's something very wrong with what he's suggesting, or at least with the way that other people in other camps have interpreted what he's suggesting. But he has an interesting idea that, the indeterminism of quantum mechanics is where we can leave open the idea that there might actually be a chaotic element or a random element to being. And maybe he makes a better argument for it than that, and actually gives a good argument for how there can be will in the universe. But most of what I know about Arthur Eddington has come from his critics, and they say that all he's really arguing for is randomness and chance don't really count as free will. I mean, if you're determined to act the way you act, then it's not your choice. But if it's random, it's not your choice either. It has to be the product of the agent choosing that makes it happen. It can't just be random. So in any case, I shouldn't say anything negative about it. Maybe my reading this month should be some Arthur Eddington and those quantum physics guys who think they can justify it that way. Anyway, there's some contributions from Kant and Hume and Thomas Reid and there's all those added suggested books for the people in the class that we can talk about if people are interested in specific camps. All right, so let's do one more thing. This is the last bit we'll talk about before we get into a general discussion here. So the unbroken chain of causality. This is what determinists believe. This is what hard determinists believe. The Big Bang made the very next thing happen, made the very next thing happen, made the very next thing happen. Every single physical event in the universe happened if what was sufficient to cause it to happen was there. And it didn't happen if what the state of the universe prior to it happening did not contain the sufficient cause for it to happen, right? It's all determined, and this unbroken chain leads right up to now, including the words that I'm choosing in the sentence that I'm speaking right now, and that's just how the universe works. The libertarians think that, they're not stupid. They don't not believe in causality. They don't not believe in physical causality, but they believe that occasionally, just occasionally, there's a break in the chain. And the break in the chain happens when an agent makes a choice. Agents' choices are like mini Big Bangs that start off a new chain. So they believe not only that all of the physical world they can believe that the whole physical world works in a completely deterministic way, and they can even and usually believe that most of my choices are mindless things that are just happening and a product of what made me make my decision, and I don't even know what the causes were. It doesn't have to be that everything I do is the free will choice of an agent, but that occasionally, just occasionally, maybe even just once, it's possible for the chain to be broken and an agent to act. Okay, that's what libertarians believe. Here's what some people believe, which is that chain is broken all the time by lots of different things. It's broken by probability and randomness. It's broken by the chaotic element of being. It's broken by all sorts of choices that agents make. There's all sorts of ways to imagine this chain breaking. But the point is that it's not libertarianism unless an agent is the reason why the next link in the chain is the way it is. Okay? This is not libertarianism. Libertarianism, first of all, it isn't a radical denial of physical deterministic laws. And secondly, it wouldn't exist if everything was just chaotic, right? You wouldn't really have choices. How could you identify a free choice happening in a sea where everything is totally chaotic? How would you be able to distinguish that between an agent chose something and, hey, it's just another random thing that happens? So libertarians don't believe in something like this typically. although the panpsychists do, and there are people who think that determinism works on certain levels of examining the physical world, but at the base of reality there is something like a universal principle of will. Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, there's plenty of different people that have views like that there's something of will at the nature of being entirely. But interestingly enough, some of those are fatalists. They don't actually. Well, in any case, we don't have to get into all of that. We'll get into that stuff in years 2 and 3, plenty. What's mainly important for us to understand is that the hard determinist believes in this picture, absolutely believes in this picture, and there cannot be a break in the chain, not only by free choice, but for anything. There can be no break in this chain, because their whole reason for denying free will is their belief in this chain. If they think that to not believe in this chain is madness, it's insanity, it's incoherence, it's not really something you can believe. You think you can believe in a break in this chain, but if you really examine it as thoroughly and as seriously as they do, you'll realize that the only way you can possibly think about the world is as an unbroken chain of causality. Now, just because if the chain is broken for any reason, the determinists are wrong, but there still might not be free will, right? So you can break the chain and the determinists can say, there's a random chaotic element to being. What do you know? There's some quantum mechanics going on, or maybe things just happen and we always try to force them into something that makes sense. And now we can prove to ourselves that's not true or something. Even if that were the case, they wouldn't have to believe in free will. So they're starting with determinism. And because they're serious about their determinism, they're saying there's no room for free will. The libertarians are starting with free will, and they say, I know that that's real. You can't get rid of that. Therefore, either to a small degree or to a large degree, we have to accept that chain breaks, right? Remember, the libertarians and the determinists both believe in that first conditional statement. If determinism is true, then there can't be free will like we want to have it. And of course, the compatibilists are a different group. This is just a picture of chaotic chaosticians. So what we're going to do now is get rid of this, and we're going to have our discussion. And so this is the last time. I've got to move this to the larger screen. I really need to move the camera so it doesn't look like I'm looking away from everybody, but I can't look at that small screen with the cameras. So let's do this. Let's unmute. Let's have our conversations. I want to ask you guys what you thought about the readings. There's the video of the reading, and plus you have the books. We're going to look at the notes given to us by the individual who couldn't be here. And in any case, if you're there, go ahead and unmute yourselves. In the meantime, let me pull up this message. Welcome.
The AC on. Is that too loud?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, the AC isn't bothering anybody? Okay.
No, you could even be louder if you wanted with the mic.
Okay. Let's see if I can sort that out.
So my first question is, I wanted to know, as you guys read this introduction, sort of looking at the different paths or the different camps in this argument, were there any things that surprised you? Were there any views that seemed particularly attractive that you maybe never thought of before? Do you have a general idea of where you think you end up in this argument at the end of it?
Myself, let's see. Interestingly, I think that I, just being new to all this, I feel like maybe preemptively, I'm like, I feel like determinism just is the more kind of logical. It's like the status quo, like gold standard. It seems like sensible starting point. And
agreed.
I guess I'm interested in like refutations of it. And as I was reading the intro, what was it? Was it the Mills Hume idea or something like that.
Yeah, they
Um,
seem to like that a lot when they were introducing it. At least that's what I picked up on.
yeah, when I read it, I was like, okay, it's a little interesting, but it seemed a little weird and arbitrary, and I was glad that they sort of mentioned that later on in the intro that it was, they sort of like highlighted its weaknesses, and it was like, yeah, that does make sense. It's not, doesn't really, it didn't strike me as a attractive or appealing idea.
It didn't strike me that way either. I thought they spent a lot of time looking at it. I think they liked it more than I do, maybe. But
Yeah.
I think I'll agree with you also that the determinists, there seems to be something impressive about their commitment, right? Because we all feel like there's such a thing as free will. And the determinists are saying, look, give up on your feelings and start thinking. I'm going to commit to the logical consequences of the thoughts. And we're going to look at Paul Ray first, and he's going to really try to hold us there. But there's definitely something impressive about the stand that they're taking to say that intellectual integrity and honesty ought to force you to agree with us at some point if you have it. Something like that. They're brave enough to stare into something that most people don't want to think is true. Did you pick up? Is that what you were feeling about their perspective?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it, and especially when they reference the different, proponents of the idea. It just seemed like, I don't know. It just seems like there's like almost a rich history that surely these people have worked this issue out over the centuries, and it just seems like, I don't know, maybe just going by tradition or just going by like the big heavyweights of philosophy or um, um, I don't know, literary criticism. Some of the people referenced in there weren't necessarily philosophers, but it just seemed like the the volume of deep thinkers seemed to be on the side of determinism. But
Yeah, well, I think that might have more to say with Edwards and Papp, to be honest.
oh,
So,
really?
yeah, I mean, I think in history, the greatest thinkers don't mostly fall into this camp, but in our day and age, where the heads of philosophy departments tend to lean in this direction more than they ever have in history. Um, we're very much in a post-Cartesian scientism age where affirming the premises necessary for science is the thing that you sort of instinctively feel is a good thing to be doing. Um, we will look at some pretty impressive refutations of it after we look at some really good adherence of it, and so we'll be able to work out our thoughts on it to some degree. But um, for instance, Edwards and Papp included Clarence Darrow. Now, Clarence Darrow is not making an argument that most hard determinists would even agree with, right? Clarence Darrow is saying if you're a mass murderer and you're on trial, and we have all the evidence in the world that you did it, he's actually making an argument in a courtroom to get psychopathic killers to be found not guilty, and he
I
succeeded.
noticed that.
He
I hated that.
succeeded. He succeeded in doing that. Interestingly enough, he's the same lawyer. If you've ever watched Inherit the Wind about the Scopes Monkey trial, he's the same lawyer that play was about, and he went and argued in defense of the teacher who taught evolution in the southern, I think it was a Tennessee school that had banned the teaching of evolution. But earlier, so when you watch that play again and you see it was that gold standard guy. What's his name? William Jennings Bryan is the guy who was arguing to prosecute the teacher. And in the play, their names are something different. Let's see. Inherit the Wind. I got to remember. I'm just getting too old to remember things. But Henry Drummond and Matthew Harrison Brady. So those are the characters in the play. But Henry Drummond is the character is based off of Clarence Darrow, who was the actual lawyer, if I remember correctly, who argued in the Scopes Monkey trial. And the William Jennings Bryan character, who was Matthew Harrison Brady, he says, "We remember what you did in that trial. It was obscene what you did." And he's referring to this other thing that they're referencing in this introduction, where he actually got these two murderous young men off, not by saying they didn't do it, but by saying, how could they help it? The Big Bang, causal nexus, its unbroken chain of causality. They didn't choose their parents. They didn't choose their grandparents. He's making this very eloquent speech. Most hard determinists don't even believe in that. Most hard determinists say, yeah, you don't have an option not to do something other than what you're inclined to do. That's why we need to punish you, so that we can create the inclination in another direction. So I would say that the introduction by Edwards and Papp was very heavily leaning on the determinist side. I mean, they did a fair job of talking about the other camps, but they barely mentioned the theological ones. They barely mentioned James, and they do a good enough job of arguing that there's a debate there and everything. But the text that they put in, they're like, oh, the greatest lawyer America ever produced. Like, yeah, well, he was a great orator and really fantastic, and whatever. But most
I
hard
had heard of him,
determinists.
and I had no idea what case he was involved in, but I do know that somewhere in the back of my memory banks, when I heard the name, when I read the name, and also listened to the video, Clarence Darrow, I was like, oh, I've heard that before. I have no idea why I know that name, but from the childhood or whatever, or walking by a TV when I was 8, I don't know, but I know that name. I had no association with whatever he had done. But then I saw what he had done in the first example, I believe it was, and I was like, well, this is a bad outcome for determinism, in my opinion.
It's
I'm
pretty
just gonna put it
shocking.
out there. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, first of all, are we assuming that the individual is more important than society? I mean, there are other philosophical considerations, I would say.
Right. So it's important to remember that most hard determinists.
Lawyers are lawyers. They have a
Yeah.
job to do, and they advocate for their clients. Some are better than others, but they are generally liars. And we all know this. But,
Fair enough, probably. It's important to remember that most hard determinists don't even agree with Darrow on that. Most hard determinists still think it's important to imprison murderers, and for some of the reasons that you mentioned, and probably others as well.
Can
But
I
yes,
answer my first thought about this?
please.
About the introduction of this class, and the first things we are looking at is determinism versus free will. I had never really, I mean, my main introduction to the concept of free will was a Rush song when I was a kid. It's called Free Will, and it's written by a libertarian. And my other thoughts, a little more pertinent ones, I suppose, or it seems like, I mean, it's pretty obvious. Listen, if you're a Filipino growing up in the Philippines, a little Pinoy guy who could dribble the fuck out of the basketball, and you got a wicked jumper in the Philippines, you ain't getting in the NBA, right? I mean, there are literally no Filipino players in the NBA because their free will can't overcome the determinism of them being in the Philippines, also being genetically short, right? And this might not be the best example. This is the first thing that came to my mind. And then, however, well, not the first thing, but it's one of the, yeah. Anyways, so like, you can take your free will all over Philippines, but you can't get your free will into the NBA. I would suspect that even if you have a wicked jumper, and you could do a crossover, and you can do all.
Okay, good. So this brings up another limit.
This brought to my mind. Hold on, and that brought to my mind. There's kind of an XY axis for some of this stuff, and I don't know how to plot it.
Yeah.
Right. But you have determinism. You have genetics. You have not only the race or the country or the city, neighborhood, socioeconomic. I mean, there's all these things that affect the predeterminists. However, the person who believes in free will and they can overcome it has more of an advantage going through life than someone who believes things are predetermined. Generally, unless they are a very a fortunate birth, or they have like really good genetics, then you can do anything you want. So that kind of goes back to the point.
Now, that's an interesting argument, because I wonder what a determinist would say about that, because it's very pragmatic what you're saying. It's like, look, a person could have a better outcome in life if they believed in their own moral responsibility, and if they even believed in their own ability to act as an agent and make choices. A determinist might say, yeah, let's spread that belief if it makes for a better life. Now, usually determinists don't believe that, because they're advocating determinism. And so they would be, if they really came to that conclusion, they would pretend to be libertarians, even though they were doing it for deterministic reasons. But it's an argument based on consequence, and consequence is something that determinists believe in. So that might even be a good argument to take to the determinists and say, look, believe in determinism all you want. The outcome is not going to be desirable if everybody believes in that. So argue the opposite, or believe you'll live a better life if you believe you have free will. You'll be determined to live a better life if you believe you have free will. Would be a difficult argument for a determinist to respond to. They could, and Paul Ray's going to anticipate that argument, the first guy we're going to read, and he feels the need to make a case for why, if we get rid of our illusions of free will, we'll actually live better lives. But he does feel the need to do that. So that is a legitimate part of this conversation, believe it or not. And William James, after doing good philosophical work to show that both camps can't be as certain as they think they are, he invents pragmatism. And his entire pragmatic approach is saying, look, we can still use philosophical principles to figure out, what's a better thing to put your money on, basically, if you can't be sure. So we'll get to that eventually. That's an interesting thought. There was something else you said, though, that's also interesting, which is there's a difference, right? Just like there's a difference between hard determinists and, there's a difference in the libertarian camps between believing that you can sometimes make a free choice and believing that every time you think you make a decision, you're actually making it of your own free will. And there's another difference between that and believing that you have godlike powers to do whatever you want, right? Just because they believe you have free will doesn't mean that you have omnipotence. And so whatever you will to do, you can do, right? There's still real world consequences, and most libertarians don't believe in an absolute kind of freedom. They think that some of what you do is free, and that plays a serious and important, necessary role in the history of events. But they don't think that most of the things you do are free necessarily, or even most of the things that you think you're doing of your own free will are actually free. And they certainly don't believe that you have the power to do anything you will to do. Although there are people who think that, obviously, that's not what is necessary to believe to be a libertarian. So that's worth pointing out. And we'll understand these camps better as we read each of the contributors from them. Those are really good points, Pat. Thank you.
Hey, also, I was kind of surprised because I got my book today. Well, it showed up yesterday. I opened it today, and it came from Britain, and I've never received a book in a canvas. Basically, it's like a nylon or Royal Mail airbag. It's a big
very cool.
It's like a zip tie around. I should post a picture, probably.
You should post a picture. I'll include it in the material.
But I thought that was no wonder it took so long. I mean, I did see it was coming from the UK, but I didn't know it was going to arrive in a synthetic type of a burlap bag. At any rate, I was surprised that there's no mention of Nietzsche in the whole book.
Yeah, well, this is our first year
course.
I
saw, I could have.
Yeah,
I thought that was odd.
Well, this is our first year course. Nietzsche's pretty heavy stuff. We're going to do a lot of him in years 2 and 3. But this is our intro, and Nietzsche's a hard one to wrestle with, even for really serious philosophers and people who dedicate their entire careers and lives to philosophy. Often choose to stay away from him. So he's not necessary reading unless he's necessary reading, right? You kind of have to make him your primary focus. He's just that kind of a character.
Makes sense.
So there's no Nietzsche in there. And remember, we're choosing this modern introduction to philosophy primarily because it's going to be emphasizing a group, the types of thinkers that I might not have emphasized if I put together my own list of people to read excerpts from. It's kind of leaning in the opposite direction of myself. So that
I did watch a video on William James. I read a wiki, and I haven't read any of his works or anything like that. But
interesting.
He seems like an interesting guy as an American. And he's got a gay. I mean, William James is kind of a gangster name too, I have to say.
Yeah, he's quite interesting, isn't he? I remember you and I talked about
gangster.
this. Yeah, he's an interesting guy. I remember you and I discussed him a bit in a private conversation before the class.
He just kind of came up, because I started looking up determinists and came across his name, and he was involved in the conversation. And actually, he sounded kind of like a gunfighter from the West. And they, from what I read, he was in some ways a preeminent American scholar from the West, or
He's one of America's best philosophers. Some people think of him as the major contributor America gave to philosophy. So if you go back to the website for our class, we now have the notes from our general intro and the reading over here. We've got our class, we've got the notes from this one right here, and our reading for today, and then this will go live. So we're going to include that. But you'll notice all of the books on the side are the suggested extra reading books. And so there's about 100 of them for this first month course. And my hope is that each person will find what they're most interested in and pick one. So if we scroll down to the William James section, those are a little heavier than some of the earlier ones, but you might be interested in getting a book. It's my hope that everybody in the class will find one book out of the 100 that they want to add to their readings for the month. Let's just see here. This one's probably pretty good for this. That one's probably pretty good too. So if you're still looking for your monthly reading book, this one or this one might be, this one here might be the best one to pick from. If you click on it, it should open up. It should open up a new tab where you can purchase it cheaply. $12 isn't too bad, I guess. Anyway, I was speaking with the individual who couldn't be here today, and we're going to read his notes, and we're going to discuss what he feels like saying based off of this. But you'll see that his perspective is leaning towards a compatibilism, and I suggested that he might want to read Daniel Dennett's Freedom Evolves as the book for the month, because that's a very good book. Okay, why don't we do that? Why don't we read his notes? So when he was reading the introduction, he said determinism versus free will, and he started asking some questions. Can a person walk without being taught to walk just by free will, right? If a pack of wolves raised a human being, would that human being ever be able to walk without being taught to do so, right? There's got to be some outside input that even makes it possible, he's starting to question. Well, you'd have to at least witness another human doing it. A reality is only what we have access to. Okay, so there's an element of outside input that's necessary, but are you a puppet that's just the product of that outside input? That's the hard determinist position. That's all you are. Or are you the product, as a compatibilist would say, of a lot of input in nature and nurture and your past, and all of that goes into what makes you the kind of person that you are and what makes you inclined to do something, but also is there some magical libertarian free will that's an ingredient in there? Or can all of that taken together account for some kind of moral responsibility and will at the same time as the compatibilist would think? Does a baby cry for the sake of crying or because of a reason such as being hungry, scared, cold, or alone? And then he says, does a baby cry to hear its voice and demonstrate its saying, I am, its free will? How is it not free will if the baby only cries to listen to its voice? And that's very interesting, because I think you guys have probably seen those videos of young parents carrying their baby, and they walk past a door frame, and when they walk past it, they hit the door frame with their hand, and then they go, "Oh!" and the baby immediately starts crying, as if it had hit its head, even though it didn't hit its head. I mean, this is like a 2-month-old, 3-month-old baby. It's not. It doesn't have any words yet, and yet it's crying when nothing bad happened to it. And so the question is, the hard determinist might interpret that by saying, well, the parent being in distress is why the baby ever cries, because it's not developed enough to really be its own thing. And so as soon as the parent goes, "Oh, what's wrong?" it cries. It's just triggered to cry because of that. But a libertarian might say, I think that what's happening here is that your whole assumption that everything is determined, that might be instinctual, and it might be a thing that you think you have to think. But even a 2-month-old baby is modeling other characters as intentional, other personalities as having intent. And, that's just as ingrained as anything else. And so why is this baby acting like it's been hurt when it hasn't been? That's a pretty funny looking thing. If you haven't seen those videos, go ahead and look them up. They're pretty funny.
I think it's kind of funny that that's an example, because babies are pre-wired to mimic and pre-wired to be in need of parents. I think that a lot of, well, I'm not sure I think that.
No, they're pre-wired to be in need for sure. But who's the baby mimicking?
Oh. Well,
there's no other infant crying. The baby's just 2 months old. It only knows 2 adults. The adults never cry.
Well, it's not the mimic. Okay, it's not the mimicking, but it's the wiring. The wiring is anything that disturbs its. I mean, how much do babies sleep? Have you seen that? I mean, that's crazy.
Tons.
Yeah. So anything that disturbs the sleep is automatically going to make me grumpy. And I don't know about a baby, but I reckon probably pretty close as far as like, you know what I mean? It's a human being.
I don't know if these babies are asleep. I think that the parents
I'm
holding
not
the
trying
baby.
to sound argumentative or anything.
No,
I'm just
please.
thinking about it,
you should sound argumentative. We're here to argue.
I am not saying one way or the other, but I am saying that babies. Philosophical examples for me when you use a baby aren't valid. It's not valid.
I mean, it's valid. I don't know if it's valid to conclude certain. The conclusion might not be accurate.
Baby doesn't have free will by biology. Period.
Well, okay, so some libertarians would say it does, but you're right. Most even libertarians, but especially compatibilists, would say a baby doesn't have free will. Free will grows and mutates. You have to become a full person before you have free will. And a clam doesn't have free will, but over evolutionary history, we've developed the ability to have free will. So you're absolutely right. Most people would be in the camp of saying, look, even if there is free will, a baby doesn't have it. But it's a hell of a thing, those videos. I would play them, except I'm afraid I'm new to YouTube, and I'm afraid of playing a video.
I've seen some of those videos. I have seen those videos to answer your original question.
They're pretty funny, aren't they?
It's pretty funny. Yeah, they are so reactionary to any stimulus. And they're just like, I think that's kind of biological, and it is determinist, I suppose, in that instance. But when you're talking about adults, and all the adults are the ones arguing, right? The babies are looking for needs or whatever. So
sure.
It's a different thing.
I mean, sure. We can't ask the baby what it's really thinking, but I think it's legitimate to examine the evidence and try to make sense out of it. But you're right. It's not like there's one answer to this. I mean, the determinists would interpret it one way and the libertarians maybe another. But we should examine it and see how we interpret it, because I'm not sure. For instance, if you hold keys in front of a baby, the baby doesn't cry like it's been hurt. Why is it crying like it's been hurt? Because it hears a noise and it hears the parent go, "Oh, what happened?" I mean, if the parent hadn't hit the wall to make the sound, but just went, "Oh, what happened?" would the baby cry? Maybe it would. So maybe it's just triggered to do that whenever the parent does that. But maybe it's modeling the parent as being concerned with it, and it's trying to increase that concern, or it's inclined to. I don't know. It's not a conclusive argument, as you say. In fact, most libertarians wouldn't try to make an argument based off of that, because most libertarians wouldn't believe that if you're crazy, you don't have free will. And if you're an infant, you don't have free will. They don't think everything a human does is based in free will, as you point out. But he keeps bringing up these babies. And I think it's interesting that there seems to be some weird kind of evidence that maybe they cry because they want things. And maybe sometimes they just cry to express to the universe that they're here. And I don't know if that's the case, but we don't know that it's not the case either. And parents with their experience, sometimes
So what
they
do you
might
think about animals? Animals aren't as self-aware as we are, mostly.
Let's try it. Hey, baby, come here. Oh, what happened? What happened? He's not doing anything. He's looking at me like I'm stupid. Never mind.
He's looking healthy, though. I'm glad to see it.
Oh, he's a good boy. He's a good boy.
I'm glad to see he's looking.
Thank
I didn't
you.
ask for a while, but I know you rescued that dog, and you went through a bit of a rough spell with him. But it looks like he's doing really well and healthy. I'm glad to see it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. He's a happy boy. He's happy to see you guys. Hey, Norm, say hi to everybody. He's just a silly boy. No, he's doing great. His skin's better. He's so healthy. Thank you so much. So yeah, we don't know what's in a baby's mind, but this idea that maybe there's a nascent form of causality and maybe there's a nascent form of free will evident there. Who knows? Let's see what else he says, because I think this is interesting stuff to think about. I should ask him if he's a new father or something, because this is a good source of evidence to consider. How is it not free will if the baby only cries to listen to its voice? I mean, I do wonder. I wonder if maybe there are cries like that infants make sometimes. I think that I wouldn't rule it out just because of an assumption. Babies cannot survive independently with free will. Their will being is determined by causes external to their free will, their parents. So he's basically thinking, there's evidence on both sides, and I think it might be a combination of determinism and free will. So I think he'll really enjoy Daniel Dennett's Freedom Evolves as a really good book to start with. If anybody else is leaning towards the compatibilist side of things already, before we even read the determinist side, there's some other books you might consider as well. All right. Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that baby stuff when he comes back next time, or maybe later tonight if he gets in later. He had some stuff to do. So what else? What else does anybody think about this from what we've looked at in this introduction? They really didn't talk about the pragmatism too much. They only mentioned the fact that there's Catholic theologians who have an argument for free will from divinity. So there's another type of compatibilists, which are the pseudo-problemists, and we've mentioned that before. But essentially, we're going to be reading some excerpts from them. And essentially what they say is, look, when you say free will, the thing you really care about is totally compatible with determinism. And there's just an ambiguity in the use of our language. So I'm going to cut it apart and show you that this kind of free will doesn't exist, but nobody wants that kind of free will to exist because that kind can't exist with determinism. But all of this, all the stuff you were worried that we were going to lose, the moral responsibility and the fact that the choice originates in part from us and all of that, that can still exist within determinism. So I get to have my cake and eat it too. You just have a language problem, which is different from the Daniel Dennett kind of compatibilism, which also says the same thing, but then goes further and actually argues, here's how it's possible that your decisions can be based on your environment and your nature, which you didn't choose your parents or what you were be composed of. It can be determined by those two things, and it can be determined by what Daniel Dennett calls second-tier volitions, which is something akin to, I want to do cocaine, but I want to not want to do cocaine. And that second-tier volition might make me say, look, I keep doing cocaine. I'm addicted to cocaine. I don't want to do cocaine anymore, but I want to do cocaine. I just want to not want to anymore. So maybe I should sign up for rehab. Maybe I should get new friends. Maybe I should exercise. Maybe I should do the sorts of things that will make me less inclined to be determined to do cocaine in the future. And so, yes, I'm the product of, all of my choices are determined, but one of the things that determines my choices is internal to myself. It's not that it's magic. It's not magic fairy dust where I am an agent of freedom and in a mysterious libertarian sort of a way. It's just that all of the triggers external to myself go into making my decision. And the kind of thing I am goes into making my decision. But also the kind of thing I am is a complicated prefrontal lobe that has the ability to look at and observe other parts of my brain. And so some of the triggers that go into my decision are internal to myself. And that's how, as he puts it, freedom can evolve inside of a deterministic worldview. We're not actually going to read any excerpts from him, or really, I don't think anybody who is in his camp exactly, which is sort of the only reason why I feel the need to talk a little bit about his perspective, independent from what we're going to read, just because it's not really touched upon. So what we'll do is we will end the class here, and then we'll do an after conversation where we continue to talk about these things for a while. But this is the last intro class. So the next class, there's a lot of reading. I'll upload the reading. Take careful notes, because it's going to switch from 95% me talking about what we're going to talk about to 60 to 70% us actually having debates and talking about Paul Ray and his arguments. So we'll remember, the first thing we care about is making sure we've understood Paul Ray correctly. We might be inclined to be determinists, and we might want to grab up his arguments because we think they're powerful. We might be inclined to be determinists, and we think his arguments aren't good, and so we want to make better arguments. We might be libertarians and think, oh, this guy's the devil. I think he's wrong about everything. It doesn't matter what our perspective is. We have to really understand exactly what he's saying and what he's not saying, so that we can agree with him, disagree with him, have a conversation with him accurately rather than just in our imagination. So we're gonna pay careful attention to the readings that we're gonna do of Paul Ray, make sure we understand him correctly, and then we're gonna have most of the class, maybe 60% of it, will just be your opportunities to debate with each other, and I'll sort of act as an arbiter. So we're gonna finally get in the swing of it completely in our next class. So I'll do the readings for that. You guys do the readings for it. We should mention what those are before we go into the after show conversation. So we finally finished all this introduction stuff, and we're starting even early. We're supposed to start August 1st. So we're really in the swing of things now. So Friday, let's read pages 10 good. So Friday, let's read pages 10 through 19. All right, so the first half of Paul Ray, and then for Tuesday, we'll read the second half of Paul Ray. And so we'll have two classes where we can discuss his ideas. All right, and on that note, we're going to listen to the Rush Free Will audio song in the after show, since we don't want to get flagged for copyright. So we'll end it here.
That's so funny.
Yeah, I want to hear that. So
are you familiar?
Listen, I'm like a chick's music collection. No rush. So there's no rush to end this, but we're going to end it now anyway, and we're going to go listen to some Rush. And thanks for suggesting that.